capitalist organizations. And reading briefly from this act, the purpose, it stated, was of the affordable housing goals is to facilitate the development in both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac of an ongoing business effort that will be fully integrated in their products, cultures, and day-to-day operations to service the mortgage financing needs of low and moderate income persons, racial minorities, and inner-city residents, all very inspiring at the time. You would wonder, how is an inner-city resident going to afford to buy a home? Well, not to worry. There'll be no down payment. There'll be very low rate of interest. This was a Senate committee report on the legislation. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were subject then to mandates to increasingly Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bought mortgages in the secondary market. They don't originate them, but they often very much present at the creation of these mortgages, because when they originated, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cut a deal to buy them right away and take them off the hands of the private sector. Now, that's in 1992, and now I want to jump ahead in telegraph fashion, and I'm sorry if those numbers are a little bit small, but they're at least worth showing. They summarize the situation as of mid-2008, just before Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac began to collapse big time, and just before the real housing collapse began. And what they show is that there were 27 million non-traditional mortgages out there by then. That's half of all the mortgages out there in the country. And that of these 27 million mortgages, 70% were held by the federal government in one form or another. Many of them by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, most of those by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but there was also FHA, Federal Housing Authority participation. The Community Reinvestment Act was also a very important part of it. That's another story in itself. But 70% of all the mortgages that were non-traditional mortgages were held by the federal government, 60% of principal value. So just for starters, we're talking about, if we begin in 1992 and now we ended in 2008, this was the result. The federal government basically being in the non-traditional mortgage business. Now these numbers come, there's a story in itself on these numbers. They come from a guy named Edward Pinto, who was the chief credit officer of Fannie Mae in the late 1980s. He's since become a bit of a firebrand about the abuses of federal government in this field, but he was an expert in putting together these numbers, and he submitted them to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. I don't know if you ever heard of them. They were appointed by Congress to investigate the financial crisis and come up with an analysis of the causes. They came in with their report about 7 months after legislation was passed, which was an interesting sort of put the cart before the horse. The commission was supposed to come up with findings, and then maybe you pass legislation. The Dodd-Frank legislation was passed 6 months earlier. But the interesting part of this story is that Pinto, who clearly had credentials, came to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission with his numbers, and he asked them to be vetted. He is excellent in understanding what is a subprime mortgage, because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as you might imagine, were not always straightforward about it. Sounds like a subprime and acts like a subprime. It is a subprime. And so his numbers were key, and yet they were ignored by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. I might also mention that Ed Pinto was interviewed briefly, a couple of times in fact, for that movie Inside Job, but since he didn't tell Ferguson and his people who made the movie what they wanted to hear, you won't find Pinto in that movie either. Now, that's the basic picture of the role of the federal government. Now let me now get to another depiction of what went on. This is an interesting case. This is from a book called 13 Bankers by Simon Johnson, who's at MIT, and James Kwak, who's from McKinsey. A part of their book is an astute analysis of crony capitalism, but they miss a good 2/3 of the story. They completely exempt the federal government from active intervention in the non-traditional mortgage market. And they too commit a sort of amazing gaffe in dismissing the federal government and going after these 13 bankers. They write, "The financial crisis was not primarily due to Fannie and Freddie. The riskiest mortgages were simply off limits to Fannie and Freddie." Now notice, that's a footnote, an endnote 77 in their book. So they're making this statement that Fannie and Freddie were not primary culprits, and they're endnoting it with 77. And again, in the age of the internet, one wonders why people do this, because if you look at endnote 77, they're citing an article by, it actually says, C. Charles Calomiris and Peter Wallison blame Fannie Mae and Congress for the credit mess. It sounds like a rather surprising way to back up a statement that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were not involved. Just for starters, but if you look up the article, you find, for example, that they're writing, "The vast accumulation of toxic mortgage debt that poisoned the global financial system was driven by the aggressive buying of subprime and alt-A mortgage and mortgage-backed securities by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The poor choices of these two government-sponsored enterprises, GSEs, and their sponsors in Washington are largely to blame for our current mess." So here again, difficult to trust scholarship these days, but it's not too hard to check on that scholarship in the age of the internet. Most things are online. Here again, a claim is being made, and a source is being cited to back up that claim, and it directly contradicts the claim that is being made. Now, we don't want to do without don't want to do without Krugman's amazing statement about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as well. This was a real howler. He wrote in an article called "Fannie, Freddie, and You" that Fannie and Freddie had nothing to do with the explosion of high-risk lending. High-risk lending, not ending. That's a misspelling on my part, sorry. In fact, Fannie and Freddie, after growing rapidly in the 1990s, largely faded from the scene during the height of the housing bubble. Well, I just showed numbers demonstrating that they owned the lion's share of the government's high-risk mortgages. But let's go on with what Krugman has to say. Partly that's because regulators, responding to accounting scandals at the companies, placed temporary restraints on both Fannie and Freddie that curtailed their lending just as housing prices were really taking off. Let's continue with Krugman. Also, they didn't do any subprime lending because they can't by law. So whatever bad incentives the implicit federal guarantee creates have been offset by the fact that Fannie and Freddie were and are tightly regulated with regard to the risks they can take. You could say the Fannie-Freddie experience shows that regulation works. Now, I might tell you briefly that there are fact checkers at the New York Times, but none of the op-ed columns are fact checked. I might tell you briefly that my column is fact checked at Barron's, and while fact checkers can miss interesting subtleties, I've seen articles written in the New Yorker about economics that probably were fact-checked, but they're still totally off base because the facts were a little bit too subtle for the fact-checkers to check. This is not subtle. A fact-checker would have come to me if I'd written that and said, they can't do any subprime lending because they can't by law. The fact-checker would have told me, I can't find the law that says they can't do this. Could you show me the law? That's what a fact-checker would ask me. Well, there is no such law. It doesn't exist. It was completely made up out of whole cloth by Krugman. And I mean, the amazing thing on top of that is that if you just checked the Mortgage Banker Monthly at the time, Fannie and Freddie had been publicly announcing for years their aggressive moves into non-traditional mortgages. This was the press releases from HUD about mandates on Fannie and Freddie. If they were breaking the law, they were doing it so flagrantly, one wonders why somebody didn't come put the handcuffs on them. Well, when Krugman wrote this, and he was in fact corrected by Raghu Rajan, he started to double down, as inevitably he does. He never admitted that he made a mistake. He started to say a lot of other things. We needn't chase him further on this, except to say that you don't want to read Krugman on this or any other subject of what's happening in the economy, because more often than not, he'll get it wrong. And there's not enough time in the day to check it.